The screaming has become my language now, the only words I remember how to form. 3 centuries have passed since I knew how to speak Low Gothic, since I could form thoughts that weren't just raw sensation translated into sound. But let me take you back to when I still had a name, when I was still something that could be called human, or at least what the Imperium transforms humans into when it needs living weapons for its endless wars of conquest. My name was Carleon Mirsha, and I was a battle brother of the Salamander's chapter, 3rd Company, 8th Tactical Squad. I was 217 years old when they took me, which sounds ancient by baseline human standards, but was relatively young for one of the Adeptus Astartes. The imperial propaganda called us angels. The priests of the Ministorum claimed we were the Emperor's finest creations, touched by his divine will. They lied as they lied about everything else. We were gene-forged weapons, surgical constructs built from children stolen from their families, subjected to organ implantation, chemical conditioning, and hypno-indoctrination, until whatever we had been before was buried under layers of artificial loyalty and combat programming. I remember, or I think I remember, because memory becomes unreliable when centuries of agony rewrite your neural pathways, being 12 years old on Nocturne. My father was a blacksmith in one of the settlements near Mount Deathfire, his hands perpetually scarred from working the forge. He had these calluses on his palms, thick as leather, and when he placed his hand on my shoulder the night before the trials, I could feel the heat still radiating from his skin. He'd been working late, crafting what he said would be a blade worthy of a salamander if I succeeded, worthy of a son even if I failed. The tribes tell stories, he said to me, his voice rough from breathing forged smoke for 40 years, that the salamanders are blessed by the Emperor himself, that Vulcan watches over them from beyond death. They say if you're chosen, you'll become more than human, become immortal, become holy. He paused, and in that pause I heard something I was too young to interpret. Doubt, perhaps, or grief. But you'll also stop being my son. The boy who helps me pump the bellows, who burns his fingers trying to sneak fresh-baked bread from the cooling rack, who laughs when his younger brother makes faces during the evening meal. That boy will be gone. I didn't understand then. I thought transformation meant improvement, that becoming Astartes meant becoming better. The chaplains who selected me from among the trial survivors never mentioned that better meant having 19 additional organs implanted into your body over years of surgical procedures. Never mentioned that the hypno-indoctrination involved having your personality systematically dismantled and reconstructed around principles of loyalty to a rotting corpse on a throne 10,000 light-years away. Never mentioned that the gene seed integration felt like having your cells individually ignited from within, as the modified DNA rewrote your biological programming. But I survived. I became Astartes. I learned to wear ceramite armor that weighed more than 3 grown men, learned to fire a bolter with accuracy that defied human capability, learned to recite the Promethean Creed without thinking about what the words actually meant. Into the fires of battle, unto the anvil of war, we chanted. And I believed the chaplains when they told us we were noble, that our purpose was righteous, that the Emperor's guidance directed our hands as we burned worlds in his name. They called us the Salamanders because our primarch, Vulcan, came from Nocturne, a death world where enormous reptilian creatures dominated the volcanic wastelands. The chapter culture emphasized endurance through flame, protection of the innocent, and craftsmanship. We were taught, conditioned, really, to believe we were different from other Astartes chapters, more humane, more connected to baseline humanity. We maintained ties to our tribal families when possible, returned to Nocturne for festivals, crafted personal weapons in the forges, as our ancestors had done. It was propaganda designed to make us compliant, to give us an identity that would reinforce loyalty. The Salamanders weren't more humane. We burned heretics and Xenos just as efficiently as any other chapter. We weren't protectors. We participated in the same genocidal campaigns that defined the Imperium's expansion. But the carefully maintained mythology made us believe our slaughter had meaning, had nobility, had divine sanction from a corpse emperor who had never protected anyone, who couldn't even protect himself from the sun who nearly killed him 10,000 years ago. I served for 205 years. I fought on 17 different worlds, killed thousands of beings the Imperium classified as enemies. I watched entire cities burn under our flamers, heard the screams of Xenos and human heretics alike as the Prometheum did its work. The chaplains told us their suffering was necessary, that these deaths served the Emperor's grand design, that our violence was sacred violence. I repeated their words in my evening prayers, said the litanies of hate against the Xenos without questioning whether hate was something worth cultivating, whether beings deserved extinction simply for existing outside the Imperium's control. On Varsavia Prime, I helped exterminate an entire hive city that had fallen to Genstealer cult influence. 3 billion people lived in that hive. We couldn't distinguish the infected from the uninfected, couldn't separate the cultists from the innocent civilians who had no idea what was happening. So we killed them all. The tech priests calculated it was more efficient than attempting planetary quarantine and selective elimination. I stood on the observation deck of our strike cruiser and watched the cyclonic torpedoes reduce the hive to molten slag, watched 3 billion lives end in nuclear fire, and felt nothing except satisfaction at mission completion. That's what they had made me into, something that could witness genocide and feel pleased about efficiency metrics. The incident that led to my capture happened on a world whose name I never learned, in a system the Imperium designated only by numerical classification. We were pursuing an Eldar raiding party that had attacked an Imperial Guard staging area, killed several thousand soldiers, and stolen something the inquisitorial representative accompanying our force said was absolutely critical to recover. They didn't tell us what. The Inquisition never explained, only commanded, and we were conditioned to obey commands from proper authority without requiring justification. The Eldar raiders fled into a section of space that our navigators identified as unstable, where the boundary between real space and the warp grew thin. Our captain hesitated. Even with our indoctrination, some survival instinct remained, but the Inquisitor invoked his authority and demanded immediate pursuit. So we followed, because that's what the Imperium had built us to do. Follow orders even when those orders led to obvious doom. The Eldar hadn't fled. They'd led us into a trap. But these weren't the craft world Eldar we'd been expecting, weren't the desperate survivors of a dying race trying to preserve what remained of their civilization. These were Drukari, the dark kindred who had rejected salvation and instead built an empire in a pocket dimension sustained by suffering. They had been waiting, their vessels emerging from the webway in a coordinated ambush that spoke of careful planning, of intelligence gathering, of understanding exactly how the Imperium's arrogance could be weaponized against it. Our strike cruiser died within the first 3 minutes of engagement. The Drukhari weapons didn't simply destroy. They inflicted destruction that seemed almost artistic in its precision, carving through our void shields and adamantium hull with dark light lances that unmade matter at a molecular level. I was in the portside armory when the hull breach occurred, when vacuum and fire competed to kill me first. My Astartes physiology saved me from immediate death. The multi-lung allowed me to survive in the void temporarily. The osmodular reinforced skeleton prevented explosive decompression from pulping my organs, but survival in the void is temporary, measured in minutes even for Astartes. I saw 17 of my battle brothers torn into space, saw Brother Carton caught directly in a dark light beam and simply cease to exist from the waist up. Saw the ship's human crew, thousands of men who had been told their service to the Emperor was holy, that their deaths would earn them a place at his side, die screaming prayers that no one answered because there was no one listening. Had never been anyone listening except the administratum overseers who needed bodies to crew their ships. Then the boarding parties arrived. I'd fought Eldar before, had been trained to counter their speed and precision with overwhelming firepower and tactical coordination. But the Drukari moved differently, fought differently. They weren't trying to win battles efficiently. They were hunting, savoring, selecting. They killed most of the crew outright, but certain individuals they marked with strange crystalline tags that paralyzed without killing, left their victims conscious but immobile. I was one of those marked. I tried to fight as the paralysis spread from the tag embedded in my chest, tried to bring my bolter up for one final shot, tried to at least die killing enemies rather than be taken captive. But my muscles locked, my enhanced nervous system hijacked by whatever technology the Drukari had embedded in me. The last thing I saw before they dragged me into their transport was Brother Sergeant Corell, my squad leader for 90 years, reaching toward me with one hand while the other clutched at the gaping wound where a Drukari blade had opened his throat. He couldn't speak. His larynx was destroyed, but his eyes held something I rarely saw in Astartes: fear. Then he died, and I envied him. The Drukari vessel smelled wrong. That's what I remember most vividly about those first hours of captivity. The smell. Not just alien, not just unfamiliar, but fundamentally wrong in a way that bypassed rational analysis and triggered some deep mammalian recognition of predator, of danger, of death. The air tasted of chemicals I had no names for, recycled through systems that seemed designed to maximize discomfort rather than functionality. Everything was sharp angles and cruel aesthetics, architecture that existed solely to remind its inhabitants that suffering was the foundation of their civilization. They kept me paralyzed for what I estimated was 6 days, though time measurement became difficult in captivity. The paralysis drugs or technology, or whatever mechanism they used, didn't render me unconscious. I remained fully aware as they transported me through the webway, as they brought me into Komorag, the dark city that existed in the webway's depths, sustained by stolen souls and orchestrated agony. Komorag defied description in any language I knew. It was vast beyond comprehension. A metropolis that had grown like a cancer through pocket dimensions for thousands of years, where the laws of physics bent around the concentrated suffering of countless trillions. The architecture seemed alive, seemed hostile, seemed designed by beings who found beauty in torment and elegance in cruelty. Everywhere I could see, and they positioned me so I could see, so I could witness and despair, there were captives from 1,000 different species being subjected to horrors I lacked vocabulary to categorize. I saw humans flayed alive, their skins worn by Drukari as fashion statements, while the skinless victims remained conscious, kept alive by technologies that defied human medical understanding. I saw Xenos species I didn't recognize being slowly transformed into living sculptures. Their bodies reshaped into impossible configurations, while they screamed in languages I couldn't understand, but whose agony I recognized universally. I saw what I thought were statues, until I realized they were captives encased in crystal, fully conscious, experiencing time at a drastically slowed rate, so that seconds for observers translated to years or centuries for the imprisoned. This was the reality behind the Imperium's propaganda about Xenos. Yes, they were dangerous. Yes, they were hostile, but not because they were inherently evil. Not because the Emperor's divine wisdom had identified them as threats to humanity's righteous dominance. They were dangerous because the galaxy was a charnel house where every species fought for survival by inflicting extinction on others. Where predators like the Drukari had perfected the art of extracting life itself from suffering. Where there were no gods protecting anyone because there had never been any gods. Only powerful beings that lesser species mistook for divinity. They brought me before a homunculus, one of the Drukhari's master fleshcrafters, who had transformed themselves into living nightmares through endless self-experimentation. The propaganda sermons back in the Imperium had described Xenos as monsters, but those descriptions failed to capture the reality of confronting a being that had spent thousands of years remaking itself into something that existed solely to perfect the science of suffering. The homunculus who claimed me, and that's the verb they used, claimed, as if I were property rather than person, object rather than subject, called itself Celian. though I learned later that names among the homunculi were more like titles, descriptors of their particular expertise in the art of anguish. Celian had abandoned anything resembling humanoid form centuries ago. Its body, a mass of whipping tendrils and surgical appendages, and organic weapons and sensory organs that shouldn't exist, all wrapped around a central core that might have once been Eldar, but had transcended taxonomy through self-inflicted mutation. It spoke, and its voice was wrong, not harsh or grating, but perfectly pleasant, almost soothing, which made the words it spoke infinitely worse. Astartes, it said in flawless low Gothic, its accent carrying hints of a dialect that had been dead for millennia, suggesting it had been practicing human language since before the Imperium existed. The corpse gods, little tin soldiers, so proud of your modifications, your enhancements, your precious gene seed. You think your technology makes you superior, makes you weapons beyond mortal flesh. Let me show you how primitive your understanding truly is. The paralysis released, and for one moment I thought I might fight, might kill this abomination and die with some measure of dignity. But before I could move, Celian's surgical tendrils struck faster than my Astartes reflexes could follow. Embedded themselves in neural clusters, in organ systems, in the gene seed implants that defined what I was. Not to kill, the Drukari had perfected the distinction between injury and death to a degree that made imperial medical technology look like crude butchery. But to control, to map, to understand every aspect of my enhanced physiology. Fascinating, Celian purred, and I could feel its instruments inside me, reading my biological systems like data files. The Mechanicus fools understand so little of what they've created. These implants, this gene seed, you're walking miracles of biological engineering that your Imperium treats as mere tools. Do you know what you represent, little soldier? Regeneration, endurance, pain tolerance far beyond baseline humans. You're not weapons, you're canvases. The examination lasted hours, during which Celian catalogued every enhanced organ, every modified system, every aspect of my Astartes physiology. It paid particular attention to the preomnor and the Betcher's gland, the organs that allowed me to survive poisonous substances and synthesize corrosive acid. I didn't understand why until much later, when the relevance became horrifyingly clear. The cruelty of your Imperium, Celian mused while its instruments violated my body, is that they've given you all this capacity for survival and told you it makes you superior. Told you it serves some grand purpose in their corpse god's plan. But survival isn't a gift, little soldier. Survival is raw material. And you're going to survive for such a very, very long time. They took me to what I initially thought was a medical facility, some sort of laboratory where the homunculi conducted their research. I was wrong. It wasn't a medical facility because medicine implies healing, implies care, implies some investment in patient well-being. This was a workshop where the homunculi practiced their art on living subjects who served simultaneously as canvas, paint, and audience for masterpieces composed in agony. The chamber they assigned to me was relatively small, perhaps 10 meters square, though precise measurement became difficult as my sense of space deteriorated. The walls were some sort of organic material, living tissue stretched over architectural frameworks, and they pulsed with a slow rhythm that might have been breathing or might have been the captured souls the Drukari used to power their technologies. Everything in Comirage ran on suffering, I learned. Their lights, their weapons, their immortality itself, fueled by stolen pain. At the chamber's center was the apparatus they'd constructed for me specifically, custom designed based on Celian's analysis of my physiology. It looked almost elegant in a horrible way, a fusion of Drukari aesthetics and surgical precision, restraints that would interface directly with my nervous system, keeping me immobile while allowing full sensation. Support systems that would sustain my life indefinitely, recycling waste, providing minimal nutrition directly into my bloodstream, maintaining organ function below the threshold of health, but above the threshold of death. And at the core, the burning mechanism that would become my entire existence for the next 3 centuries. Celian explained it with the enthusiasm of an artist describing his masterpiece. Your chapter venerates fire, yes? Vulcan's sons, born of flame, tested in the forges of Nocturne. Such delicious irony. I'm going to burn you, little salamander. Not kill you with fire. That would be crude, wasteful. No, I'm going to keep you in a perpetual state of burning, your tissue combusting and regenerating in an endless cycle. Your Astartes' healing abilities will prevent death but not prevent damage, creating a loop of destruction and reconstruction that will continue as long as I maintain it. I tried to speak, tried to invoke the teachings they'd programmed into me during hypno-indoctrination. The Emperor protects, I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew they were lies, knew they had always been lies. Knew that no divine being was going to intervene because there was no divine being. Just propaganda designed to make weapons like me compliant. Celian laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from bone. Your emperor is a corpse that failed to protect even himself. He sits rotting on his throne while his imperium crumbles around him. And you pray to him? No, little soldier. The only protection you'll know from now on is what I choose to grant. And I choose to grant you none. They activated the apparatus on what I designated as Day 1, though I would later lose track of days, of weeks, of years, of decades, until time became meaningless except as a measure of suffering endured. The burning started at my extremities, fingers and toes first. Not fire in the conventional sense, not flames licking its skin, but something worse, a chemical process that ignited tissue at a cellular level. Combustion contained just beneath the surface, so that I burned from within rather than without. My Astartes pain tolerance, the modification that allowed me to fight through injuries that would incapacitate baseline humans, worked against me here. I couldn't go into shock, couldn't retreat into unconsciousness, couldn't escape into the mercy of systemic shutdown that protected ordinary humans from trauma beyond endurance. I experienced every individual cell igniting, experienced my nerve endings transmitting pain signals that my enhanced nervous system dutifully delivered to my conscious mind with perfect fidelity, experienced my Laraman's organ and Susan membrane desperately attempting to heal damage that was being inflicted faster than regeneration could occur. The healing kept me alive but couldn't keep me from burning, creating a cycle where tissue would combust, begin regenerating, combust again before regeneration completed, over and over in a loop that had no natural termination. The pain was absolute. There's no useful comparison, no metaphor that captures what it means to burn eternally. Human language evolved to describe human experience, and this transcended human experience into something that required new vocabulary, new concepts, new frameworks of reference. If I'd still believed in the imperial creed, I might have thought I was experiencing the emperor's divine judgment, might have believed this was punishment for sins unnamed. But I knew better. This wasn't divine, wasn't supernatural, wasn't metaphysically meaningful. It was just torture, refined to perfection by beings who had spent thousands of years learning to make consciousness suffer. After the first week, or what I estimated was a week based on sleep-wake cycles I could no longer track reliably, Celian expanded the burning up my arms and legs. Not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, methodically, with scientific precision. It would visit periodically, sometimes daily, sometimes less frequently, to observe my responses, to take measurements, to adjust the apparatus based on data collected from my ongoing suffering. "You're adapting beautifully," it said during one such visit, its tone suggesting genuine pride in its work. "Your catalepsian node is trying to force you into rest cycles, but the pain keeps waking you. Your Betcher's gland is overproducing acid in a stress response that's serving no purpose. Your gene seed is triggering accelerated healing that only prolongs your suffering. Everything your Emperor's servants put inside you to make you a better weapon is now weaponized against you. Isn't that beautiful?" I tried to hate Celian, tried to channel the indoctrinated hatred the chaplains had programmed into me toward Xenos, toward enemies of the Imperium. But hate requires energy, requires emotional capacity beyond mere survival, and I had none left. The burning consumed everything: thoughts, emotions, identity, until I was nothing but pain given barely sufficient consciousness to recognize itself. Around day 40, Celian added a new dimension to my torment. The Becher's gland in my throat, the organ that allowed Astartes to produce corrosive acid as a weapon, had been identified as particularly interesting during the initial examination. Celian began harvesting it daily, extracting the acid for whatever purposes the homunculi had, then stimulating the gland to force regeneration and production of more acid before the extraction process repeated. The harvesting involved instruments inserted through my mouth and down my throat. I couldn't close my mouth, couldn't resist, couldn't even scream effectively because the instruments blocked my airway that would puncture the gland and drain it completely. The sensation was internal burning combined with external burning, the acid searing my throat tissue even as the cellular combustion continued throughout my body. Two completely different types of pain that my consciousness attempted unsuccessfully to process simultaneously. Celian began conducting what it called neural amplification around day 70. My nervous system, it explained with that terrible enthusiasm, was still operating within normal parameters, still processing pain through biological mechanisms that had evolved to protect organisms through aversion response. But protection wasn't the goal here. Experience was the goal, and human neural architecture was insufficiently optimized for pure sensation. The process involved introducing foreign organic material into my spinal column and brainstem, Drukhari biotechnology that interfaced with my existing nervous system and amplified pain signals by orders of magnitude. Not simply making pain worse in a quantitative sense, but changing the qualitative nature of how I experienced sensation, removing natural limiters and tolerance thresholds, transforming my consciousness into something that existed purely to suffer. After the neural amplification activated, I discovered that what I'd experienced for the previous 70 days had been merely the baseline, the starting point. Now the burning became something that consumed my entire conscious existence, that rewrote my understanding of what sensation could be, that turned every microsecond into its own distinct eternity of agony. Time itself seemed to slow from my perspective, seconds stretching into subjective hours, each individual nerve firing becoming its own discrete event that I experienced with hideous clarity. I tried praying again during this period, not because I believed, but because the prayers were among the few coherent thoughts I could still form. The catechisms and litanies so thoroughly programmed during hypno-indoctrination that they persisted even as rational thought degraded. By the fires of Prometheus, I would think, unable to speak any more because my vocal cords had burned away and regenerated and burned away again too many times to function. Into the fires of battle, unto the anvil of war. The Emperor protects. Vulcan's mercy. The Emperor protects. No one answered. No divine intervention came. No relief manifested. The universe remained exactly as indifferent as it had always been, and I continued burning because that's what Celian had decided should happen. Because the Drukari needed suffering to sustain their immortality. Because the galaxy was a place where might determined reality, and I had lost the contest of might so completely that I no longer qualified as a participant, only as a resource. Year 1 marked a significant deterioration in my cognitive function. Not from physical brain damage. The homunculus technology prevented that. Kept my brain tissue perfectly oxygenated and functional, despite the continuous burning. But from psychological fracture, under sustained trauma that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. I began losing memories, not randomly but systematically, starting with the most recent and working backward through my existence. I forgot the faces of battle brothers I'd served with for decades. I forgot the layouts of ships I'd lived on for years. I forgot the names of worlds I'd fought on, battles I'd won, enemies I'd killed. The memories didn't vanish cleanly, that would have been mercy, but rather degraded into fragments, partial images without context, emotions without reference. Knowledge that I'd forgotten something important, but couldn't remember what. My father's face began fading around year 2. I fought desperately to hold on to that memory. That one connection to who I'd been before the Imperium took me and remade me into a weapon. But memory requires neural pathways, and those pathways were constantly being reconstructed through the cycle of burning and healing. Burning and healing, burning and healing. Each regeneration cycle rebuilt tissue slightly differently, introduced tiny errors in neural architecture that accumulated over time until the pathways that stored specific memories no longer existed in any recoverable form. I tried to remember his hands, those calloused blacksmith hands that had guided mine when I was learning to work the forge, but the memory slipped away like water through fingers I no longer possessed in any functional sense. I tried to remember his voice, the rough sound of it, the way he'd called my name before it became Astartes' designation Kaleon Mirshah, and was just something simple and human. But the memory dissolved into the endless present-tense agony that defined my existence. By year 5, I'd lost language comprehension. The words I'd known in Low Gothic, in Nocturnian tribal dialects, in the battle cant of the Astartes, they became meaningless sounds, arbitrary phoneme combinations that no longer connected to concepts or objects or ideas. I couldn't think in words anymore, couldn't form thoughts in linguistic structures, could only experience raw sensation and the most primitive emotional responses. Celian found this development fascinating. "You're regressing," it observed during one of its periodic examinations, its tone carrying notes of scientific curiosity. Not to childhood. That would still involve language, still involve conceptual thinking. "You're regressing to something pre-human, pre-sapient, pure experience without interpretation. You're becoming a very sophisticated sensory organ, nothing more. Beautiful." I couldn't understand its words anymore, couldn't process language, but I understood tone, understood that Celian was pleased with my deterioration. Some primitive part of my consciousness recognized that my suffering entertained my torturer, that my degradation served as evidence of its skill. But I lacked the cognitive capacity to hate, to plan revenge, to maintain any emotional state more complex than endless fear. The burning continued. That was the only constant, the only reality that persisted through the erosion of everything else I'd been. My body existed in a state of perpetual combustion and regeneration. My tissues burning away and regrowing and burning again in an endless cycle, maintained by Drukari technology and my own Astartes' regenerative abilities turned against me. I couldn't die. The homunculus apparatus kept me alive with absolute reliability, and I couldn't escape into unconsciousness because the pain stimulation prevented any form of rest or retreat. Somewhere around year 15, I lost the concept of self. Not gradually. There was a specific moment when the neural pathways that maintained ego consciousness finally degraded beyond reconstruction. I stopped being I and became merely a location where suffering occurred, a phenomenon rather than a being, sensory data without anyone experiencing the sensation. This should have been mercy. Should have been the final escape into oblivion that would end awareness of torment. But the homunculi had anticipated this possibility and engineered their apparatus to prevent it. When my natural consciousness dissolved, the foreign neural material they'd implanted took over, creating an artificial sense of self that existed solely to register pain. I remained aware, not as Kaleon Mirshah, not as a salamander, not as any coherent identity, but as a basic witness function, consciousness without personality, experience without experiencer. Celian called this state optimal. During one of its visits, year 20, year 30, I'd lost all capacity to track time in meaningful units. It explained to someone else, perhaps an apprentice or colleague, using me as a demonstration subject. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood I was being displayed, being used as evidence of technique mastered. The art, Celian said to the other presents, is maintaining awareness without identity. Identity provides coping mechanisms, allows the subject to contextualize suffering within narrative frameworks that provide meaning and thus diminish pure experience. But awareness without identity is raw sensation, unmediated by interpretation. This Astartes has been burning for decades now, and it experiences every microsecond of combustion, without any psychological defense mechanisms, because it no longer possesses the self-structure required to deploy them. The other voice asked a question about methodology perhaps, or technique. The neural amplification is key, Celian responded. Standard pain processing involves signal modulation, natural suppression mechanisms, threshold effects. I've removed all of that. Replaced it with technology that presents sensation directly to the awareness center without any filtering. Combined with the Astartes regeneration preventing death and the apparatus preventing unconsciousness, you create perfect eternal suffering. No adaptation, no tolerance, no escape. Just endless burning, experienced with absolute clarity, forever. Forever. The word meant nothing to me in terms of linguistic content, but the concept settled into what remained of my consciousness like a weight. Not years or decades or centuries of suffering, but literally endless continuation. Perpetual burning that would persist as long as the Drukari maintained their technology and had reason to keep me alive. I want to tell you that I maintained some core of resistance, some fundamental human dignity that Celian couldn't touch, some indomitable spirit that persisted despite everything. But that would be a lie. Another comfortable fiction like the imperial propaganda about the emperor's protection. Celian broke me completely, reduced me to nothing more than a mechanism that registered suffering, and I lacked the capacity to maintain anything resembling resistance or hope or defiance. The decades continued. Year 50 came and went, marked only by Celian's occasional comments about anniversaries. Year 75 passed. Year 100, each year identical to the last. An endless present tense of burning without variation, without development, without change, except the slow accumulation of neural damage that the apparatus immediately repaired to keep me capable of experiencing further damage. Sometime after year 100, Celian introduced additional subjects to my chamber. Not for company. The homunculi understood that social interaction might provide psychological relief, but for comparison and contrast. Other captives in various stages of their own torments, their own specialized tortures, arranged around my apparatus so that I could see them suffering and they could see me suffering. Our collective agony feeding the Drukari's need for pain. I couldn't communicate with them, couldn't offer or receive comfort, couldn't even recognize them as fellow sufferers because I lacked the cognitive framework to understand concepts like other people or shared experience. They were merely additional sensory data, visual information of moving flesh and heard information of screaming that existed in the same perceptual space as my burning, but had no connection to it. One of them was human, I think. Baseline human, not Astartes. He'd been there for less than a year and still possessed language, still retained enough cognitive function to scream coherent words. He begged constantly, pleaded with the homunculi for death, for mercy, for anything except continuation. His words meant nothing to me linguistically, but I recognized the tone of desperation, the fundamental mammalian panic sound that transcends language. He asked me for help once, or tried to, his words directed toward my apparatus. I couldn't help him, couldn't help myself, couldn't even understand what helping would mean in any practical sense. I could only burn, only exist as a location where suffering occurred, only continue registering sensation without any capacity to respond to that sensation in meaningful ways. The human died eventually. Not from his torture, the homunculi were too skilled to lose subjects to mere death, but from some sort of raid or attack that damaged the facility. I heard sounds of combat. Heard screaming that was fear screaming rather than pain screaming. Heard the wet sounds of bodies being destroyed violently. The human's apparatus was damaged in the chaos, its life support failing, and he expired within minutes, his final expression something that looked almost like gratitude at being granted oblivion. I envied him for being allowed to die. But my apparatus remained intact, my burning continued uninterrupted, and the raid or whatever had occurred resolved without affecting my situation in any material way. Year 150 marked another significant deterioration. The portions of my brain responsible for processing visual and auditory information began degrading from sustained overload. I went blind first, not from eye damage. My eyes burned and regenerated constantly along with the rest of my tissue, but from neural exhaustion. The optical processing centers simply ceasing to function after a century and a half of continuous operation. The blindness should have been mercy, removing visual input and thus reducing the total sensory information I needed to process. But Celian had anticipated this possibility and modified the neural amplification technology to compensate, increasing the intensity of remaining senses to maintain overall suffering at consistent levels. The burning became even more prominent in my awareness, the primary sensation around which my entire existence organized. Deafness followed blindness by what might have been a few years. The auditory cortex simply stopped processing sound, stopped translating vibrations into meaningful input. The sudden silence was briefly disorienting, the first change in my circumstances in decades. But then the apparatus adjusted again, intensifying pain sensation to fill the gap, ensuring my suffering maintained constant magnitude regardless of how many senses I lost. By year 200, I possessed no functional senses except pain itself. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't smell or taste or feel anything except the burning. I existed in complete sensory isolation, except for the singular input of cellular combustion. My entire consciousness collapsed down to a dimensionless point that registered only its own suffering. This became my eternity. Not death, not life, but a third category that transcended both. A state of existence that served no purpose except to provide suffering that sustained Drukari immortality. I was an engine that produced agony, a biological system optimized solely for the experience and output of pain, maintained indefinitely by beings who had perfected the technology of torment across thousands of years of practice. Year 217 brought visitors that weren't homunculi. I couldn't see them, couldn't hear them, couldn't perceive them through any conventional sense, but the burning pattern changed, minutely, barely detectably, but changed nonetheless. The apparatus had maintained absolute consistency for decades, and even the slightest variation registered in my awareness like a shockwave through the monotony of eternal combustion. The change lasted only moments before returning to baseline, but those moments represented the first deviation from pattern in longer than I could conceptualize. Something had happened, something external to my immediate torment, something that affected the broader facility where Celian kept me and countless other subjects in perpetual states of specialized suffering. I couldn't understand what it meant, couldn't contextualize the change within any framework of cause and effect, because I no longer possessed the cognitive architecture required for causal reasoning. I only knew that for a brief moment, the burning had fluctuated, and then it had stabilized again, and I continued existing in the dimensionless point of consciousness that registered nothing except its own agony. What I didn't know, couldn't know, lacked all capacity to know, was that a Salamander's strike force had entered Komorag on an unrelated mission, that they'd detected Astartes biosigns during their infiltration, that they'd begun systematically tracking those signs through the Dark City's impossible architecture. My chapter had never stopped looking for the brothers lost in the ambush 2 centuries earlier, had maintained search protocols across multiple sectors, had investigated every rumor and intelligence fragment that might lead to our recovery. The Imperium's propaganda claimed this persistence demonstrated the Emperor's love for his chosen warriors, demonstrated the sacred brotherhood of the Astartes, demonstrated the nobility of never abandoning fallen comrades. The reality was more practical. Astartes were expensive to produce, required decades of training and gene seed that was irreplaceable if lost. represented significant resource investment that the Imperium preferred to recover when possible. And the Salamanders specifically maintained cultural traditions around brotherhood and loyalty that made abandoning captured battle brothers psychologically difficult for individual Marines, even when tactical logic suggested moving on. But I knew none of this, understood nothing beyond the burning that continued without interruption, even as my chapter fought through Komorig's defenses, even as they located Celian's facility, even as they breached the workshop where dozens of subjects screamed in dozens of different configurations of torment. The rescue, when it came, began with sudden cessation. The burning stopped, not gradually, not with tapering intensity, but instantaneously, completely, the cellular combustion halting mid-cycle as power to the apparatus was severed. For the first time in 217 years, I existed without pain. The absence was more shocking than the original onset had been. My entire consciousness had organized itself around suffering, had adapted to pain as the singular constant reality, had restructured every neural pathway and cognitive process to accommodate eternal burning. When the burning stopped, I didn't experience relief. I experienced absence, void, an emptiness so profound that my consciousness couldn't pass what was happening. I was still blind, still deaf, still isolated in sensory deprivation, except now lacking even the pain that had served as my only connection to existence. I might have been dead, might have finally achieved the oblivion I'd lost the capacity to wish for, except that some minimal awareness persisted, some barely functional consciousness that registered the absence of sensation without possessing the framework to understand what absence meant. Then something touched me, and I would have screamed if I'd still possessed vocal cords capable of producing sound, if I'd still possessed lungs capable of pushing air through those cords, if I'd still possessed the neural connections between intention and physical action that would allow voluntary sound production. But I possessed none of those things. 2 centuries of burning and regeneration had degraded my physical coordination beyond recovery, even with Astartes' healing abilities. So, instead, I simply existed in a state of pure panic, without expression. The touching continued. Multiple someones, multiple sources of physical contact, handling my body with purposes I couldn't determine. I was being moved, extracted from the apparatus that had sustained me for longer than most humans lived entire lives. My body, I realized distantly, no longer functioned in any meaningful way. My muscles had atrophied from 2 centuries of complete immobility. My bones had weakened despite Astartes' modifications. My organs operated only because the apparatus had forced them to operate. Without the machinery maintaining my life, I should have died within minutes. But whoever was moving me, whoever had breached Celian's facility and shut down the apparatus, brought their own life support, their own systems to keep my biological functions operating long enough to extract me from Komorag. I learned later, much later, from records I couldn't read myself, but which were read to me by apothecaries, trying to understand what had been done to me, that the Salamander's force found 17 Astartes in various stages of homunculi modification. 3 had been dead for decades, their gene seed harvested long ago, their bodies maintained as artistic installations in Celian's gallery of horrors. 7 were alive but so extensively modified that recovery was deemed impossible. They'd been transformed into weapons, into furniture, into decorative objects that retained just enough consciousness to suffer, but not enough structural integrity to qualify as recoverable. That left 7 potentially salvageable subjects, and I was among them, barely by the narrowest possible margin. Functionally indistinguishable from total loss except for the persistent Astartes biosigns that registered on their scanners. The extraction from Komoraj took 14 hours, during which I experienced disconnected sensory fragments without coherent sequence or interpretation. Movement without understanding direction. Sounds I couldn't process linguistically. but which my primitive awareness recognized as combat. Vibrations suggesting rapid acceleration. Temperature changes that my thermoreceptors reported, but which meant nothing to my consciousness. At some point during the extraction, someone attempted to communicate with me. I felt pressure variations that might have been speech directed toward me, felt touch patterns that might have been someone trying to signal recognition or comfort. But I lacked all capacity to respond, lacked even the ability to indicate I was aware of the communication attempt. I was a biological system being transported, nothing more or less conscious than I'd been during the burning, because at least the burning had provided a singular focus for whatever remained of my awareness. We emerged from the webway into real space, and the transition felt like being torn apart at a molecular level. Not painful exactly, because I'd lost the ability to contextualize sensation as painful or not painful, but fundamentally wrong, a violation of the few physical constants I still possessed. My body registered that something profound had changed about the nature of surrounding reality, that we'd moved from one type of space into another type of space, but I couldn't understand what the change meant or why it mattered. They brought me to a Salamander's vessel, to Medicae facilities staffed by apothecaries who specialized in Astartes physiology, who understood how to work with gene seed implants and enhanced organs, and the complex biosystems that made Astartes different from baseline humans. They performed triage immediately, assessing damage, determining what could be repaired and what had been lost beyond recovery. The assessment took weeks. My body, they determined, was functional only in the most technical sense. My heart beat because Astartes' hearts were redundant and extraordinarily resilient. My lungs exchanged oxygen because the multi-lung continued operating through sheer biological stubbornness. My nervous system transmitted signals because the neural amplification technology was still partially active and couldn't be safely removed without killing me. But I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't move voluntarily, couldn't communicate, couldn't demonstrate any higher cognitive function beyond the most primitive stimulus response reactions. The apothecaries documented everything with meticulous detail, recorded measurements and observations, and hypotheses about what the homunculi had done to me. They treated me as they'd been trained to treat all Astartes, with respect for the investment I represented, with careful attention to my status as bearer of sacred gene seed, with professional dedication to their craft, even when their patient couldn't benefit from healing in any meaningful sense. But I could hear their conversations, even though they believed I couldn't, even though I lacked the capacity to respond or indicate comprehension. Some portion of my auditory processing had begun recovering once the neural amplification technology was removed, begun rebuilding pathways that could translate vibrations into something resembling sound. I couldn't understand language. That capacity was gone, burned away by centuries of disuse. But I could recognize tone, could distinguish between different voices, could register the emotional content, if not the semantic meaning of their discussions about my condition. They spoke in clinical terms, medical vocabulary that maintained professional distance from the horror they were examining. Subject exhibits complete sensory degradation. Neural architecture shows extensive trauma consistent with sustained torture. Prognosis for cognitive recovery is essentially null. Gene seed remains viable for extraction and reuse. That last phrase recurred frequently. My gene seed was viable, could be harvested and implanted into new aspirants, could continue the chapter's genetic legacy, even though I personally had been destroyed beyond recovery. The Imperium's propaganda called gene seed sacred, called it a gift from the Emperor through the Primarchs to their sons, called its preservation a holy duty. The reality was more practical. Gene seed was resource, was biological technology that took centuries to properly develop, was irreplaceable material that the Astartes couldn't afford to waste. They kept me alive while they debated what to do with me. Some argued for immediate gene seed extraction and granting me the Emperor's peace, the euphemism Astartes used for killing irreparably damaged battle brothers, for ending suffering that served no purpose, for mercy killing dressed in religious language that made it sound noble rather than practical. Others argued for attempting rehabilitation, for trying to restore some level of function, for honoring the Salamander's cultural commitment to never abandoning brothers regardless of condition. These were the ones who spoke about duty, about loyalty, about the chapter's traditions around protecting the helpless and refusing to give up on those who'd served. The debate continued for months while I existed in a state of minimal consciousness, aware only of basic sensory input, incapable of indicating preference or opinion, even if I'd possessed sufficient cognitive function to form preferences or opinions. I was being discussed like an object, like equipment requiring maintenance decisions, like a problem to be solved through proper application of protocol. Eventually, they brought me before the chapter master, a ceremony I understood only through fragmentary sensory input and overheard conversations. They explained my condition, explained what the Homunculi had done, explained the 2 centuries of torture and the irreversible damage and the complete absence of recovery prognosis. They presented options: immediate gene seed extraction and honorable death, or indefinite maintenance, in the hope that some future medical advancement might restore function. The chapter master made his decision based on factors I couldn't fully understand: tradition, resource allocation, precedent, the symbolic importance of different choices. He decided to keep me alive but in stasis, suspended in a state of minimal biological function within the chapter's medical facilities, maintained indefinitely against the possibility of future treatment while preventing further deterioration. But before the stasis could be implemented, something happened that changed my trajectory entirely. One of the chaplains, a brother named Gravius, who'd served in my original company 2 centuries earlier, requested permission to attempt communication, to see if any coherent consciousness persisted beneath the damage, to determine whether I possessed sufficient awareness to understand what had happened to me. The apothecaries protested that such attempts were futile, that my cognitive degradation was too extensive, that I lacked the neural architecture necessary for understanding language or forming coherent thoughts. But Chaplain Gravius invoked chapter traditions around brotherhood and insisted on making the attempt, and the chapter master granted permission for limited interaction under medical supervision. Gravius came to my medical chamber and spoke to me for hours, day after day, using techniques the chaplains employed when attempting to reach Astartes who'd suffered severe psychological trauma. He recited catechisms I'd once memorized, told stories about battles we'd fought together centuries ago, described Nocturne and the forges and the traditions I'd once been part of before the Imperium had transformed me into a weapon and the Drukari had transformed me into a victim. I couldn't understand his words. Language remained beyond my comprehension, but I recognized something in his voice, some quality that triggered fragmentary responses in neural pathways that had been dormant for centuries. Not memories exactly, not coherent recollections of past events, but emotional traces, ghost sensations of familiarity, echoes of connections that had once existed before the burning erased who I'd been. Gravius noticed the responses, minute changes in my biometrics, tiny fluctuations in neural activity that suggested some level of processing was occurring. He intensified his efforts, began incorporating more direct stimuli, tried to rebuild basic communication pathways through repetition and association. Kalian, he said repeatedly, using the name I no longer recognized. Kalian Mirshah, you are a salamander. You are a battle brother. You survived. You are home. You are safe. The words meant nothing linguistically, but the pattern of them, the repetition, the emotional weight Gravius invested in their delivery, all of this accumulated over weeks and months until something shifted, until some portion of my consciousness began trying to reconstruct frameworks for interpretation. It wasn't recovery, wasn't healing in any meaningful sense. The damage was too extensive, too fundamental, too thoroughly embedded in my neural architecture. But it was response, was engagement, was evidence that some fragment of the person I'd been still existed beneath the ruins of 2 centuries of torture. After 6 months of daily sessions, I produced my first voluntary sound since my rescue. Not speech, I'd lost that capacity completely, but a sound, a vocalization that emerged from somewhere deep in my reconstructed throat tissue, raw and inhuman but intentional rather than reflexive. Gravius wept when he heard it, his emotional control breaking in a way that was highly unusual for chaplains, who were trained to maintain stoic discipline regardless of circumstance. But he'd known me before, had fought beside me for decades before the capture, and hearing me produce any voluntary response after months of apparent vegetative existence represented something he interpreted as miraculous. The apothecaries were less optimistic. They documented the vocalization as evidence of minimal cognitive function, but cautioned against over-interpreting what might be simple stimulus response rather than genuine intentional communication. They ran additional tests, tried to determine what level of awareness I actually possessed, tried to distinguish between consciousness and mere biological activity. The tests revealed something unexpected and horrible. I was aware, not fully conscious in the way I'd been before the capture, not capable of complex thought or linguistic processing, but definitely aware, definitely experiencing my condition, definitely suffering the knowledge of what I'd become without possessing any capacity to communicate that suffering or request relief from it. I was trapped inside a body that barely functioned, inside a mind that couldn't form coherent thoughts. Aware enough to recognize my condition, but not aware enough to express that recognition or process it psychologically. The burning had ended, but the torture continued in a different form. The torture of being conscious of my own degradation, conscious of my helplessness, conscious that I would remain in this state indefinitely because the Salamander's traditions wouldn't allow them to grant me death, and I couldn't request death, and the medical technology would keep me alive regardless of whether continued life served any purpose. Gravius continued his attempts at communication, tried to build more sophisticated response patterns, tried to determine how much of my original personality might be recoverable. He refused to accept that I was lost, insisted that somewhere inside the damaged biological system I'd become, the battle brother he'd known still existed and could be reached. But I wasn't recoverable. The person Kalian Meersha had been was gone, erased by centuries of suffering that had rewritten my neural pathways so thoroughly that reconstruction was impossible. What remained was something new, something that had never existed before, a consciousness that consisted entirely of trauma responses and primitive awareness, a mind that knew it had lost something profound but couldn't remember what that something was. The only consistent response I could produce was the sound, the raw vocalization that emerged when stimulation exceeded some threshold of intensity. It wasn't communication, wasn't language, wasn't anything except noise. But Gravius interpreted it as screaming, interpreted it as my consciousness trying to express the inexpressible. And his interpretation was closer to truth than the apothecary's clinical assessments. I was screaming. Not with my voice, because my voice didn't function properly anymore. Not with words, because I'd lost words. But with whatever remained of my consciousness, with whatever fragment of awareness persisted inside the ruins of what I'd been. I was screaming constantly, continuously, eternally, a scream that had no sound but which defined my entire existence. Year 294 marked the decision point. The chapter leadership convened to discuss my case specifically, to determine whether continued maintenance served any purpose or whether mercy demanded granting me death despite my inability to request it. They reviewed all medical data, consulted with apothecaries and chaplains and veterans who'd known me before the capture, attempted to make a decision that balanced chapter traditions against practical reality. Chaplain Gravius argued passionately for continuing life support, for maintaining hope that some future breakthrough might restore function, for honoring the commitment to never abandon brothers, regardless of how damaged they became. He spoke about duty, about loyalty, about the symbolic importance of demonstrating that the Salamanders protected their own even when those protections cost resources and provided no tactical benefit. But others argued equally passionately for the opposite position, for granting me the Emperor's peace and ending suffering that served no purpose except to satisfy abstract principles. They pointed out that I couldn't serve, couldn't contribute, couldn't experience anything except awareness of my own degradation. They noted that the resources required to maintain me indefinitely could be allocated to training new Astartes, to repairing equipment, to purposes that actually advanced the chapter's mission. The debate grew heated, exposed philosophical divisions within the chapter about what brotherhood meant, about whether life had intrinsic value or only instrumental value, about how to balance compassion against practicality. In the end, the chapter master made a compromise decision that satisfied no one but ended the debate. They would keep me alive for 6 more years, enough time to reach the 300-year anniversary of my capture, a symbolically significant milestone, while continuing attempts at rehabilitation. If no significant improvement occurred by that deadline, they would perform gene seed extraction and grant me honorable death with full ceremony recognizing my service and sacrifice. 6 years. In my previous existence, as Kalian Mirsha the Salamander battle brother, 6 years had been nothing, barely noticeable in the centuries-long service expected of Astartes. But in my current state, 6 years was an eternity that stretched before my minimal consciousness like an endless void. Gravius intensified his rehabilitation efforts, spent hours every day trying different approaches, different stimuli, different communication methods. He tried visual input, though I was blind. He tried auditory input with varying patterns and frequencies. He tried tactile communication, physical contact designed to trigger association responses. He tried everything the chapter's medical knowledge and his own desperation could suggest. I tried to respond, tried to cooperate with whatever he was attempting, tried to rebuild some capacity for interaction that might demonstrate I was still present, still worth preserving. But the damage was too extensive, the neural architecture too thoroughly destroyed and incorrectly rebuilt through centuries of burning and regeneration. The most I could manage was the raw vocalization that Gravius interpreted as screaming, the one consistent output my damaged system could produce. During one session in year 297, Gravius asked me a direct question, even though he knew I couldn't understand language, couldn't process the semantic content of his words. "Kalian," he said, his voice carrying weight I couldn't interpret linguistically but recognized emotionally. "Kalian, if you can understand me, if any part of you knows what I'm saying, are you suffering? Do you want this to end? Should we grant you peace?" I couldn't answer. Couldn't indicate yes or no, couldn't communicate whether continued existence represented hope or torment, couldn't express preference because I lacked the cognitive framework necessary for forming preferences. But something in my biometric readings must have shifted, some involuntary response that the monitoring equipment detected, because Gravius's emotional state changed dramatically. His breathing pattern altered. His heart rate increased, signs of distress that I could sense even without understanding their cause. "They're right," he said quietly, possibly to himself rather than to me. "The apothecaries are right. You're aware. You know what you've become. And you can't tell us whether you want to die or want to live, because you don't have the capacity for that level of communication anymore. We've imprisoned you in a broken body and called it mercy." He stopped coming after that session. Or perhaps he continued coming, but I lost the capacity to register his presence, lost whatever minimal sensory processing had allowed me to detect his visits. My awareness narrowed further, collapsed inward to something barely distinguishable from complete absence. Year 300 arrived. 3 centuries since my capture, since the day I'd been paralyzed by Drukari weapons and dragged into Komorag to become a canvas for Celian's artistic torture. Since the burning had begun that would continue for 217 years before my chapter recovered me as a barely living ruin. The chapter leadership honored their commitment. On the 300th anniversary of my capture, they convened to review my case and make the final decision about my fate. The medical data showed no improvement despite 6 years of intensive rehabilitation attempts. If anything, I'd continued degrading, continued losing what minimal function I'd possessed upon rescue. The chapter master authorized gene seed extraction and implementation of the Emperor's peace. They would harvest my gene seed for implantation into future aspirants. Kalion Mir Shah's genetic legacy would continue even though Kalion Mir Shah himself had been destroyed, and then they would end my biological function, through whatever method the apothecaries determined would be quickest and most certain. They prepared me for the procedure with full ceremony, treated me with the respect accorded to fallen battle brothers, even though I couldn't appreciate the honor being shown. They brought me to the chapter's reclusium, placed me on an altar slab surrounded by burning braziers that echoed Salamander's traditions, surrounded me with brothers who'd come to witness and remember. Chaplain Gravius presided, performed the rituals the Salamanders used when consigning brothers to death. He spoke about duty fulfilled, about sacrifices made, about service rendered to the emperor, all the comfortable lies the Imperium used to give meaning to suffering that had no meaning. To suggest that what had happened to me served some grand purpose in a divine plan that had never existed. Kalion Mir Shah served for 205 years before his capture, Gravius said to the assembled brothers, his voice carrying through the reclusium with practiced authority. He fought on 17 worlds, bore the chapter's honor with distinction, upheld Vulcan's teachings of compassion and strength. When the emperor called him to service, he answered, when duty demanded sacrifice, he gave everything. For 300 years he endured torment we cannot comprehend, maintained his life when death would have been mercy, survived because his gene-forged body wouldn't allow him to die. And now we grant him the peace he earned, the rest he deserves, the honor of joining Vulcan and the Emperor in whatever lies beyond this existence. The words were propaganda, were comfortable mythology designed to make my suffering seem meaningful, to suggest that the random horror of my capture and torture served some higher purpose. But the brothers listening believed the words, found comfort in the framework Gravius provided, interpreted my fate through the lens of imperial doctrine that made everything seem like part of a divine plan. They believed the emperor protected, believed despite all evidence to the contrary, despite the fact that I'd prayed to the emperor for 2 centuries while burning in Celian's apparatus and received no answer, no intervention, no relief whatsoever. They believed my suffering had meaning, believed I would somehow be rewarded in an afterlife that was nothing but propaganda. Believed the lies because the alternative, accepting that the universe was random horror and suffering served no purpose, was psychologically intolerable. The apothecaries prepared the gene seed extraction equipment, moved into position around my broken body. The process would take several hours. Careful surgical removal of the progenoid glands that contained my gene seed, preservation of the genetic material for future use, verification that the extraction was complete and the gene seed viable. Then they would administer whatever combination of drugs or surgical procedures would end my biological function most efficiently. But before the extraction began, something happened that no one had anticipated. Some final fragment of my original personality, some deeply buried remnant of who I'd been before the centuries of torture, managed one last moment of clarity. One brief instant where consciousness coalesced into something approaching coherent thought. I screamed, not the raw vocalization I'd been producing for years, not the involuntary sound that meant nothing, but actual screaming, intentional vocalization, expression of the terror and suffering and desperation that had defined my existence for 3 centuries. The sound that emerged from my reconstructed throat was barely recognizable as human, more animal than sapient. But it was communication, was expression, was the only way I had to tell them that I was still present, still aware, still experiencing my condition despite all the damage. The scream continued, wouldn't stop, couldn't stop because there was no mechanism to stop it once it started. My vocal cords, damaged and rebuilt countless times, produced sound at maximum intensity without modulation or control. The sound filled the reclusium, echoed off the walls, continued without pause or variation until the apothecaries intervened with sedatives designed to suppress neural activity. But even the sedatives couldn't completely silence me. The screaming continued at reduced volume, became a constant background sound that persisted throughout the gene seed extraction. That continued while the apothecaries prepared the termination procedure. That only ended when they finally administered the lethal protocols and my biological functions ceased. The last thing I experienced, the final sensation before consciousness dissolved into whatever comes after death, was relief. Not joy, not peace, not any positive emotion, just absence of suffering. End of awareness, cessation of the endless present tense existence that had defined me for longer than most humans lived entire lives. They declared me a martyr afterward, added my name to the chapter's rolls of honored dead, crafted stories about my endurance and sacrifice that would inspire future generations. They made my suffering into propaganda, turned my torture into a teaching moment about Astartes' resilience and the Emperor's mysterious purposes, wrapped my fate in religious mythology that made it seem meaningful rather than the random cruelty it actually was. My gene seed was successfully extracted and implanted into 2 new aspirants within the year. They survived the transformation process, became salamanders, served the chapter with distinction. The genetic legacy of Kalian Mirsha continued, even though Kalian Mirsha himself had been reduced to a cautionary tale about Xeno's cruelty and a demonstration of how even the Astartes' legendary endurance could be. Overwhelmed by sufficient torture, the official records classified my case as extreme trauma requiring termination and filed the details in sealed archives accessible only to senior apothecaries and chapter leadership. They didn't want the full story spreading, didn't want brothers knowing exactly what the Homunculi could do to capture Astartes. Didn't want to undermine morale by revealing that even the Emperor's finest warriors could be broken so thoroughly that death became mercy. But Chaplain Gravius knew. He'd spent 6 years trying to reach me, trying to rebuild some fragment of the person I'd been, trying to honor the brother he'd fought beside for decades before my capture. And he carried that knowledge until his own death 2 centuries later, carried the memory of my screaming, carried the understanding that I'd been aware throughout the rehabilitation attempts, aware of my own degradation. Aware that I was being kept alive not for my benefit, but to satisfy abstract principles about brotherhood and loyalty. In his final years, as age and injury accumulated despite Astartes' longevity, Gravius wrote a private memoir never intended for distribution, never meant to be read by anyone except perhaps the chapter master after his death. In that memoir, he addressed me directly, wrote to the memory of the brother he'd failed to save. Kalion, he wrote, I pray to the Emperor that wherever you are, whatever comes after death, you found the peace we couldn't give you in life. I pray that your suffering had meaning, that your endurance served some purpose in his grand design. But if I'm honest, if I set aside the catechisms and the doctrine and the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to make the horror bearable, I suspect there was no meaning, no purpose, no divine plan. You suffered because you had the misfortune to be captured by beings who perfected suffering into an art form. You endured because your Astartes physiology wouldn't let you die. And we prolonged your torment because our traditions valued symbolic brotherhood over practical mercy. If there's judgment after death, we deserve condemnation for what we did to you in the name of honor. The memoir was sealed in the chapter archives and classified at the highest level, deemed too dangerous for general distribution, too corrosive to morale and faith. The chaplains who reviewed it after Gravius's death considered destroying it entirely, but ultimately preserved it as evidence of the psychological toll that long service could inflict even on those trained to resist doubt and maintain unwavering faith. As for me, Kalian Mirsha, who'd been a child on Nocturne, who'd been transformed into a salamander, who'd served for 2 centuries before being captured and tortured for 3 centuries before finally being granted death, I became a cautionary tale, a classified file, a name on a memorial wall that most brothers passed without knowing the story behind it. The galaxy continued its endless cycles of violence and suffering. The Imperium ground billions of lives into raw material for its perpetuation. The Drukari continued raiding real space, continued dragging captives into Komorag to fuel their immortality with stolen suffering. Celian, the homunculus who'd spent 2 centuries burning me, continued its work with other subjects, continued perfecting its craft, continued adding to its gallery of living torments. And somewhere in the warp, or in oblivion, or in whatever might exist beyond death, my consciousness finally dissolved into nothing, finally escaped the awareness that had been curse rather than blessing, finally ended the existence that should have ended the moment the paralysis tag embedded in my chest on that long-ago battlefield. If there's a lesson in my story, it's not the one the Salamanders wanted to teach. It's not about endurance, or resilience, or the nobility of suffering. It's about the fundamental cruelty of existence in a universe where conscious beings can be kept alive indefinitely while being subjected to torments that would make death seem like paradise. It's about how the Imperium's propaganda about the Emperor's protection was always lies, how the promises of divine care were psychological control mechanisms, how faith served power structures rather than providing genuine comfort. But no one who needed to learn that lesson would be allowed to read this account. The truth was classified, sealed, hidden behind layers of security that prevented ordinary brothers from understanding what could happen to them if they were captured. What their enhanced physiology might mean in the hands of beings who understood torture as science and suffering as resource. So my story ends not with redemption, not with meaning, not with any sense of purpose or completion, but with simple termination. I existed, I suffered, I died. The suffering served no higher purpose, taught no valuable lesson, advanced no grand plan. It simply was 3 centuries of agony that ended because the Salamanders finally acknowledged that keeping me alive served only abstract principles rather than any practical benefit. My name was Kalion Mirsha. I was a Salamander, and I screamed for 300 years before they finally let me die.